What's up guys, it's Z here, welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck of the Day. Today we are taking a look at Exosisters. This is a deck that I have been messing around with for quite some time now, and I feel like this deck has a lot of potential, especially that now we are expecting three very powerful cards in the future that are going to make this deck much better. But for now, this is the build that I've been playing with. It feels incomplete to be honest, because when you know that a deck is getting good support and you're trying to play it without it because it hasn't been released yet, then you always feel that the deck is a little lacking. But there are some cards that you can play in the deck to make it work even now, and the concept of the deck, I just feel like it's so nostalgic because the deck feels very similar to Zodiac. The best way I can describe this deck is that this is a reactive Zodiac strategy. There's nothing more perfect for an explanation for this deck. So now, before we begin with the video, if you enjoyed, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming content, and now let's get to the deck profile. So starting off the monsters, we have 3 copies of Exosister Stella, and now the reason I'm saying that these monsters are reactive Zodiacs is because they all share the same effect that when your opponent moves a card from the graveyard, you can actually Xyz summon an Exorcist or Xyz monster on top of them with just one material. So this is basically what Zeus do, but you have to rely a little bit on your opponent in order to do that, and they all have an individual effect. So Stella, you can special summon Exorcist a monster from your hand, and they all work in pairs. Stella works with another one, and then the other two work together. And once you use their effects with their pairs, then you also gain 800 life points, and this is because the spells and traps cost you 800 life points to activate, so it's trying to mitigate the damage you're dealing to yourself. So Stella special summon one from the grave, and if you summon the next card, which is the 3 copies of Exorcist Elise, you gain 800 life points. Elise is a card that special summons herself from the hand if you control an Exorcister, and if it's Stella that you have on the field, then you gain 800 life points, and of course, she has the Zodiac Xyz effect. So these 3 are the best ones that you need to max out because they both get you another monster on the field. The other 2 are not nearly as powerful. You need to play them at multiple copies again because there are cards in your spell and trap pool that also work with pairs, which is important to keep in mind when you're playing with your spells and traps. But these 2 you definitely need to max out because they are the ones that will get you to a rank 4 when you have another one in your hand. Now for the rest, we have 2 copies of Exorcist Sophia. This card is pretty simple. If you control another Exorcister, you simply draw a card, gain 800, have Exorcist Irene, which is her pair. She's a really good card, but she doesn't do anything on her own, which is why I don't think you need to max her out, because these cards, when you see them in your hand, you need to have more cards in order to do something. Otherwise, your play would be just to normal summon one of them and wait for your opponent to move some from the grave for you to Xyz summon. But if your opponent knows what they're doing and they read the cards, then what they'll do first is just normal summon something and run them over before they do anything else, because their attack is really low, so it's not difficult to do that. So you need to be able to be more proactive with your deck in order to be able to do stuff, so relying on that effect alone is not gonna cut it. But yeah, this card as a 2-off, I think it's perfectly fine. Same with the 2 copies of Exorcister Irene. This card, you shuffle an Exorcister card to the bottom of the deck, and then you draw a card if you control another Exorcister, and also you gain 800 life points if you have Sophia on the field, the Zoo effect again. So this lineup is pretty standard, I think, for now. We are getting a new Exorcister monster that is going to be absolutely amazing. Malfa is just going to make the deck have so many more plays without relying on your opponent, just for the fact that not only is she going to be a 1-card rank 4, but she also can Xyz for tag out even when you move a card from either graveyard, so it doesn't rely only on your opponent. So it will give you a lot more plays. But for now, this monster lineup I think is perfectly fine. I don't think that any other numbers are necessary that you need to cut or play. I feel like these 10 monsters work really well. Now for the rest of the monsters, we play 3 copies of Parallel Exceed. This card helps a lot just because of all the monsters having so little in attack mode, so you can just make them all into Almirage, so you can make this card. And also there is a play that you can use with this card in order to make Utopic Future Draco, which is going to be a really good card because Utopic Draco Future is just a monster that's very hard to out. It gives you disruptions, and in any deck that can summon it, I feel like it should be able to, and this is one of those decks because it relies so heavily on Xyz monsters. So Parallel Exceed, great card. We also play the DPE package. We have the 1 copy of Celestial with the 1 copy of Dasher. Now the reason I'm using an engine like that in this deck is because, again, it's a deck that feels incomplete, so it needs to utilize other strong engines in order to make it work right now. You can also argue that the adventure package is good for the deck. The thing is, the adventure package sometimes makes you rely on the Exorcister tag out effects more than the deck should, because it prevents you from activating Stella's effect, which is one of your main ways to get to a rank 4 during your own turn, so you can search your spells and traps, make Ailis. So if you want to play the adventure package, then of course go ahead. I've just found that it's kind of unnecessary. This engine with DP just gives the deck enough strength in order to move on its own, and I don't feel like you need to play more cards because the adventure package makes it so that you cannot run other cards like hand traps or staples that you would normally play in the deck, so it makes the deck more susceptible going second, because this deck is one of those decks that can work with a few cards, so it can play a lot of hand traps. So I feel like having space for those hand traps makes more sense, at least for me. Now, speaking of hand traps, we have a ton of them. So we have 3 copies of Ash Blossom, pretty standard. This is the best hand trap by far because it has it covers variety. It's just the card that is never going to be dead, pretty much no matter what you're facing against, which is the theme of the format, because if you're playing against decks like Eldritch, then it makes half of your hand trap lineup that you're using for other decks kind of dead, but Ash is always going to do the job. We have 3 copies of Ghost Ogre, another great card. As long as the adventure package is a thing, Ghost Ogre is always going to be a really good card to play in your deck just because it hits the Fateful Adventure. Or even if you draw it as a 6th card, it's really good because Griffon Rider does not shuffle itself back into the deck for cost to negate something. So if you Ghost Ogre it when it tries to negate something, it will not negate because it has to shuffle itself back into the deck to do the negation. So you're just gonna get rid of the Griffon Rider altogether while also getting your effect off. We have 3 copies of Effect Veiler and 3 copies of Infinite Impermanence. These 6 you can kind of switch around depending on what you're facing against at your local level. If you have a lot of Eldritch and control decks, then these cards are not really good to have in the main deck at least, just because they can be super dead against Eldritch. Impermanence not so much because you can at least set it under the column of a Skill Drain or a Gozen Match or something like that to try to negate it, but Veiler is going to be super useless against a deck like this. So if you're playing against a lot of control decks, then you can switch these with more backer removal or other cards, but if you're playing against combo, then these cards are really good. Now moving on to the spell cards, we have 3 copies of Exosister packs. Now, I feel like every search card that each of these decks get, they're more powerful than the previous one. Remember when we got Bird Call, that we always thought that a Rhoda and a special from the hand was broken? This is basically the same thing. You add an Exosister card from your deck to your hand, not even a monster, so you can even add spell or trap. You special summon one from your hand if you have the corresponding pair of the monster you searched in your field or graveyard, and it's also a quick play. And the good thing about this card being a quick play is that you can basically chain this to an activation of an opponent's card that would move a card from the graveyard, so you immediately get the monster on the field, and then the chain resolves, and you're going to get that monster's effect to Exceed Summon right away, which is the main theme of the deck. You're trying to make your opponent think that you don't have anything, so they feel safe to move cards from the grave, and then you chain this and the trap card, and you basically get monsters on the field, and then these monsters are going to activate their own effects, and basically give you free Exceeds on the field during your opponent's turn. So these cards are really good. We have 2 copies of Exosister Armament. Now, this card gives you agency in your own deck, which means that you can target an Exorcism monster you control to special summon an Exceeds monster from your extra deck with a different name from the ones you already have on the field. Now, this card, on paper, it doesn't sound too good just because it's basically a neg 1. You sacrifice this card to target an Exorcism to get an Exceeds. It is a disruption because the Exceeds monsters get disruption effects the turn they are Exceeds summoned, and they get utility effects by detaching materials, but this card, normally I would like not to have to use it, but the thing is that there will be matchups either where your opponent will play a deck that will not move anything from the graveyard, so you're not going to get their effects off ever, or they will play smart and they will not do it even though they can, so you don't get the free pluses. So you need a card like this in order to give your deck some more proactive, to be the deck more proactive. So this card is searchable. So the thing is that if you have either Vadis or Pax, and then you can search this with Michaelis, then you at least can get an Exceeds monster during your opponent's turn, regardless of what they do. So it's a decent tool for the deck. It's been working really good. I wish the effect that you could use it during your own turn was whatever your opponent had on the field, because then it would give you some really good going second power, because this deck kind of struggles going second, and the thing is that you can use this card during your own turn only if your opponent controls a monster that was special summoned from the graveyard, but still it's a really good card nonetheless, and I like playing it, at least for now. Maybe the new support will change that, but for now I think you have to play it in, at least in your main deck. If you're playing against something that you know that has to move cards from the graveyard no matter what, then you can side this out, of course. We play the 2 copies of Fusion Destiny to go for the DP. This engine is just too powerful not to have in the deck, and sometimes you just, when you have a Pax or a Vadis in your hand, and you normal special with Elise or Stella, and you have 2 monsters, you don't really need to summon Michaelis in order to get another search, and going for DP makes more sense at that point, because you do have the spell or trap card that will get you a monster during your opponent's turn, so Fusion Destiny just gives you more firepower in the deck. We play 2 copies of Cosmic Cyclone in the main deck. This deck kind of struggles against backrow decks, so I feel like you have to main deck at least some sort of backrow removal so that you are not fully unprepared for matchups like this. Of course, you're going to side a lot more, but for the main deck, I feel like 2 Cosmic Cyclones are really good, just because Cosmic Cyclone, I don't feel like it's dead against anything these days. Even if you're playing against combo, there are cards like Fateful Adventure, Pandemonium, the Virtual Ward Continuous Trap card. There are so many things you can hit even against combo decks, so I feel like Cosmic Cyclone is a good card all around. And 1 copy of Call by the Grave, because sometimes you need these searches with Michaelis in order to go through, in order to have your plays, or your Anaconda not to get Veilered, so this card just helps you from that. And the last card is 3 copies of Exosister Vadis. This special summons 2 Exorcisers from the deck that they have to be the counterparts, and it's again a card that you can use as a chain link on one of your opponent's effects that will move a card from the graveyard, similar to Pax, so you can then use both of their effects right away. And this deck is actually really good against DP because of cards like this because DP activates its effect to special summon a monster during the next turn. So when that turn comes, your opponent has no choice but to summon a monster. So if you activate Vadis or Pax during the draw phase and you get those monsters on the field, your opponent won't even start a chain link and just a Destiny hero will come back on the field, and then you can trigger all of your monsters immediately to get Xyz monsters. So that's how this deck counters DP really well and can be used against a lot of other cards like Deskbot 001 coming back from the graveyard when you summon your Aurora Dotonkins, for example. For the extra deck, we have 3 copies of Michaelis. Now, the Xyz monsters, like I said, they have effects that disrupt your opponent the turn they are summoned, and by detaching materials, they get utility effects that you can use whenever you want during your own turn. So this card, the turn it is summoned, it can target a card your opponent controls or earn the graveyard and banish it, and then during your own turn, you can detach a material, add an Exorcist spell and trap from your deck to your hand. So this is by far the best Xyz monster. It's the only one you need to max out because you're going to be summoning it over and over again throughout the duel. You need to summon this during your opponent's turn, you need to summon this during your own turn to get a Searches. All around perfect card. We have 2 copies of Exosister Caspitel. Now this card has a Flatgate effect that during the turn it is Xyz summoned, neither player can special summon monsters from the graveyard, so this can lock a lot of decks out of the game, and by detaching a material you search an Exosister monster instead of a spell and trap. So it's another really good card because it gives you a good effect during your own turn, so you need to play 2 copies of this in order to get Searches. Now the other 2, they're just one-offs for the scenarios that they potentially can come up. We have 1 copy of Exorcist Jibrin. This card is basically an imperm the turn she is summoned, and you can detach a material to boost all Xyz monsters you control by 800 attack for the entire turn. So she is crucial for some OTKs by giving you this power boost, and she's also decent of a disruption effect when you combine it especially with Michaelis. So because let's say your opponent can summon DP during the standby phase, when you have Vadis to activate during their draw phase, you're going to get 2 of those Xyz monsters on the field. So if you summon Michaelis and Jibrin, you can basically banish DP with Michaelis and chain Jibrin so that they won't be able to destroy the Phoenix Enforcer in chain link, so it will get banished. So that's one way to get rid of their opponent's Enforcer. And we have 1 copy of Exorcister Asophiel. This card is basically an Abyss Dweller. The turn it is summoned, and you can detach a material to target a monster your opponent controls and return to the hand. So it does give you some sort of removal, but the Beast Dweller's effect is why you play this card, because there are decks similar with Caspitel that they won't be able to play at all if they just use a graveyard Flatgate effect like that. Now for the rest of the Xyz monsters, the first one is 1 copy of Gaga Gaga Magician. Now this card is the reason Utopic Future Draco is so easy to summon in this deck. So what this card does is that it's a generic rank 4 monster that you can detach a material, target an Xyz in your graveyard, and you special summon it with its effects negated. So when you use your Xyz monsters, it's very easy to get them in the graveyard because of Gravity Controller. So if you have Parallel Exceed, you can then summon this, bring back the monster you linked off for Gravity Controller, and boom, you have a Utopic Draco Future on the field right away. Speaking of which, we have Utopic Future and Utopic Draco Future. I mentioned again, this card is too powerful not to run in a deck that can summon it consistently, and this is one of those decks. So even if you don't have Parallel Exceed, if you just use 2 Xyz monsters during your opponent's turn by chaining a Pax or a Vadis to an effect that will move a card from the graveyard, you already have 2 Xyz monsters on the field, or maybe even more if you have both spells and traps. So it's very easy to keep 2 during your own turn, so you can summon this right away after you get your Searches, which will give you a disruption and a very hard to deal with monster. We have 1 copy of Zeus, obviously, which play an Xyz deck, so obviously we're going to play Zeus, such a powerful card not to have in the deck. For the Link monsters, we have 1 copy of Gravity Controller. Now this card is necessary because of Parallel Exceed. For example, let's say that you have a Stella, an Elise, and a Parallel Exceed in your hand. What you're going to do is you're going to summon your Stella and then special your Elise. You're going to summon your Michaelis in the extra monster zone. You're going to get a search with Michaelis, and then you're going to link her off for Gravity Controller. So use your Parallel Exceeds effect. You're going to overlay the 2 Exceeds for Gaga Gaga Magician. You're going to bring back your Michaelis, and then you also have a Utopic Future Draco on the field, and the spell and trap that you searched with your Michaelis, which is most likely going to be either Vadis or Pax, so you can get another monster and a disruption during your opponent's turn, so you need this card in your extra deck in order to be able to do all that. We have 1 copy of Almirage, pretty much the same reason. Sometimes you don't draw enough monsters to get to an Xyz during your own turn unless you resolve your Parallel Exceed, and because all the Exosister monsters have less than 1000 attack points, this card is very... And the last cards, of course, is the 1 copy of Anaconda with the 1 copy of Phoenix Enforcer. This engine, as long as we have it, we're going to use it in a lot of decks because it just gives so much to the deck, and you don't even have to worry about the deck not being like that for a long time in case Anaconda gets banned, because this deck is not going to be like that regardless, because it's getting so much support down the road, so it's going to change multiple times throughout the 2 following sets, or maybe even more. Who knows if we get even more cards. So yeah, this deck is going to change a lot, and of course we're going to update the build every time it does so. So yep, that's the deck, guys. I feel like this deck is really fun, and it does have a lot of potential to be a really good contender, especially in a format where we have a lot of decks that move cards from the graveyard, which is basically has become the theme of Yu-Gi-Oh now because the graveyard is a second hand. So this deck can punish all those plays really well, which is why I feel like this deck has a lot of potential and it's super fun to play as well. So yep, that's the deck, guys. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming content, and we'll see you next time.